So the talk today is really about maximizing the creative capability of your brain. And it's a kind of combination of that series of talks we had on neuroplasticity and thinking of how you can shape your brain and contemporary situation and how we might use the contemporary situation to maximize the creativity of our brain. So when we were talking about neuroplasticity, we were very much reading the book, The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge, and understanding his points that he makes about how we shape our own brain through making neuronal connections and how we stimulate our brain to make certain neuronal connections. Those neurons that fire together wire together, and then we've got to use it or lose it. Those are all the kind of fundamentals of neuroplasticity. Today, a lot of what we're going to be talking about really comes from a book by Nicholas Carr. The book is called The Shallows. Part of the title is also What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. So we're really interested in what some contemporary forces are doing to shape our brain and the neuronal connections that are in there. And this is a really great book. I highly recommend the book. We're not reading a chapter out of this book because there's not a single kind of standalone chapter that I felt like made sense to use. So instead, I'm going to try to explain to you the points that Nicholas Carr makes, and then I definitely recommend reading the book. It's a fantastic read. So in the book, one of the things that it discusses a lot is the notion of intellectual technologies. And we've talked a little bit about this before. We talked about the map and the clock as intellectual technologies, but he really defines them as all tools we use to classify information, to formulate and articulate ideas, to share know-how and knowledge, to take measurements and perform calculations, and to expand the capacity of our brains. So these are things that we make as human beings to work with our brains in order to make our brains function even better. And a lot of the idea behind intellectual technologies is really based in the work of Jack Goody, who's an anthropologist, and also the work of Daniel Bell, who's a sociologist. And they have done these amazing writings about how through the history of mankind, there have been new intellectual technologies that are developed that then alter brain capability and then change human existence. And it's everything from something like a typewriter. And I'm starting with this one because it's one of those things where we can be typing and we're not thinking at all about what we're doing. We're not thinking about hitting that Q or hitting that P or R. It's so plugged into our brain that our brain is just doing that almost on autopilot. And maybe that's a particularly palpable way of thinking about intellectual technology, where it allows you to do something, just your brain plugged into that device. But the slide rule also, which none of you have, I'm sure, ever used a slide rule, but it's a similar kind of technology where you move it and it's graphic. It tells you mathematical answers in a graphic way. And it lets you kind of see and understand it, and it structures your brain's perceptions about that mathematical relationship because your brain kind of melds with that graphic device. We talked about a map, where a map was a way of thinking abstractly. Before the map, you saw geography as what I can see around. There's a mountain over there, there's a field over here, there's a bosque of trees over there, there's a stream that runs through here. But you have no idea what's on the other side of that mountain. And so without some abstract notion, it's hard to imagine that. But the map came along, and it is an abstraction that allows us to think spatially in a different way than just our experience of space, but now it puts it in a bigger and different context. It's an intellectual technology. And in some ways the newspaper is much the same thing. The way the newspaper divides out, this is arts, this is politics, this is lifestyle, this is sports. We start in our brain to categorize things that way. And if you read a newspaper on a daily basis, which hardly anyone does anymore, but if you did that, it starts to frame how you categorize things, how you think because of that. The globe is a similar kind of technology, and the truth is it's a little bit distorted, the globe, and they've never really figured out a way to make it 100% accurate, and different globes are different ways in terms of their proportion. But it is a way of us seeing the whole body of the Earth and to see geography in that way, which is very different from the way the map depicted it. We talked earlier about the clock, which is a phenomenal intellectual technology. These days, we use the clock very much as a way of parsing out our day, organizing our lives. We are very dependent on the clock as a device that works with our brain to create a lifestyle for ourselves. The sextant is, again, a kind of ancient device that really did change the mariner's capability of seeing the sky and the stars and all of those celestial bodies in relation to the Earth and in relation to navigation. A tremendous brain-shaping device. And even universities or schools are intellectual technologies. The fact that we divide ourselves up into natural sciences, and then from natural sciences into physics and chemistry and biology, and then we divide into architecture, and within architecture we have planning and landscape architecture and interior design. All of these are intellectual frameworks and technologies that then shape the way we think, and they're organizing devices. In Asia, it's something like the abacus, which makes an Asian person who grows up using the abacus think a very different way about mathematics than someone who grows up using a slide rule. So the point of all of this is just how much these technologies affect the way we think in our brain. Nicholas Carr says, it's our intellectual technologies that have the greatest and most lasting power over what and how we think. They're our most intimate tools, the ones we use for self-expression, for shaping personal and public identity, and for cultivating relations with others. These are absolutely fundamental to our culture and the way we think. Again, he says, every intellectual technology embodies an intellectual ethic, a set of assumptions about how the mind should or would work. But he also makes the point, and it's made by others as well, that when people are developing these intellectual technologies, they're often just solving a problem. They're not thinking of the implications of this in a larger sense. So sometimes you invent a clock, as they did in monasteries in medieval times, to help the priest pray 5 times a day and to parse out their day and get their prayers in. And that's the full intention of making that clock. How did they know centuries later that in some ways that clock would be producing the rat race that would make us all very stressed and very pressured by time, by this necessity to meet deadlines and to be at certain places at certain times. That was never the intention of the technological device, but it was the result of it. We looked at Norman Bell Geddes a couple of talks ago, and I mentioned how fundamentally he shaped our transportation system and our love of the car and the freeway systems and the convenience of the car and all of that. And he, again, was developing a technology that solved a problem. It allowed people to be more individualistic. It allowed them to get from point A to point B, not waiting on a bus to get me there or waiting on a train, but I can just get in my car and go there. And it gave a lot more freedom and independence, and he loved that. But He did not think forward enough to understand that would be one of the most significant polluters of our planet. By the 1960s, cities like LA were horrible. The air was yellow. There was terrible, terrible pollution from all those cars. To this day, cities like Beijing are just suffering. People's health are suffering. Their illnesses and asthma and little kids, their lungs aren't developing properly because the air is so bad. The air is so bad because of the freaking car. And he didn't think ahead to think of, well, what is that going to do for global warming? What is that going to do for carbon in the air? I mean, none of those implications were there. And with all of these technologies, it's the same way. They're developed to meet a certain need, but there also are implications that are not fully understood by the inventors of these technologies. So an intellectual technology molds what we see and how we see it. And eventually, if we use it enough, it changes who we are, both as individuals and as a society. And the effects of our technology occur at a very fundamental level. Marshall McLuhan, who's a great scholar of media, he's the one who invented the term, the medium is the message. He was sort of foreseeing the impact of media as a technology way back in the 1960s. And he said that these enter into our being, not at the level of opinions or concepts, but they alter patterns steadily and without any resistance. They just enter into us without any intention, without even any consciousness. They begin to affect the way we shape, the way we think and what we do. Intellectual technologies work their magic or their mischief on our nervous system. They actually impact our neuronal connections, quite aside from anything we may want or not want to do. Now, Thorstein Veblen dubbed this technological determinism. The technology is determining the way culture goes. And people have argued that this kind of technological process, which they see as autonomous, it isn't controlled by the people who use it, has been a real primary factor in influencing the course of human history. Way back in the 19th century, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Things are in the saddle and they ride mankind." Things are in the saddle and they ride mankind. It's not us who are determining where we're going. It's all these things that we've made with one intention, but then they take on a life of their own and they take us in a certain direction. So neuroplasticity is one of the means by which that occurs. It has enabled us to understand how that kind of control of the things occurs and how information, media, and other technologies have exerted their influence over the development of a civilization and have really helped to guide at a very biological level, at a level of neuronal connections, the history of human consciousness. So over centuries, human beings learned to read. That was not an easy thing. We started out with spoken word, and we communicated that way. In Greek times, there was a controversy over the transfer from spoken word to written word. There was a debate between Socrates and Plato over whether there should really be a switch to written word. That was deemed a kind of intellectual laziness when you were doing all of your communication by speaking. There were great orators. They had to memorize these speeches. They were really using their brain to do that. And it seemed like a kind of intellectual laziness to write it all down rather than storing it in your brain. But the written word prevailed. And even with a little kid, if you're teaching them to read, at first you read to them orally. And they're accustomed to the connection of the word to sounds and the way they've been communicating just with oral words. And then after a while, it's yet another level of development to learn how to read silently. That's another set of neuronal connections in your brain. And to really absorb that information without having to enunciate it. And then there's another level beyond that of concentrating intently and doing really deep reading, immersive reading, where in some ways your brain and the written word become a kind of single cohesive force. So in this journal, Psychological Science, in 2009, there were researchers there that were examining what happens inside people's brain when they read fiction. And so if there's a love scene in this book, and it's a very passionate love scene, and I'm doing deep reading, and I'm doing that silent, vicarious reading, the parts of the brain that are lit up when you have sex, they get lit up when you're reading that book immersively. So you actually experience that in your brain in a very intense way if you're doing that kind of really deep reading. Now, sometimes deep reading is by no means a passive exercise. It actually is a way of shaping your brain, and the reader kind of becomes the book, in the words of Nicole Spear. So this is this notion of deep reading. As I said, this developed over centuries, and it's been something that has been very important in the intellectual development of humankind. But now we have a different kind of communication device. We have digital reading and not so much literacy as the kind of learning we do on the internet. So this is absorbing information in quite a different way. And when we look at little kids and how they absorb information, learning to do reading, and how they absorb information when they're on their iPad, it's a completely different kind of thing. So actually, little kids often, when they start reading a book, if they've been on their iPad or done their little video games, they don't read from left to right, and they don't read from top to bottom. They kind of skip around on the page. That's a completely different thing than deep reading promulgates in the human brain. And we know that if we stop exercising our mental skills, we don't just forget them, we actually disconnect those neuronal connections, and the brain map is interrupted, and that space is turned over to something else. That we learned that from Norman Deutsch. So all that deep reading capability we might have had, if we don't exercise it, it can easily go away. The possibility of intellectual decay is inherent in the malleability of our brain. So that doesn't mean that we can't make a concerted effort and recapture that capability if we want to. But the point is just, if we are subjecting our brain to internet kind of input, it's going to make a different brain map than if we're doing the kind of reading that has been developed over centuries and that human beings have used to exchange information over that period of time. Now, there's this enormous change that happened maybe 2004 to 2012. And that's really when the iPhone came in and when the internet got to be a big thing. And in that period, we changed our brains significantly. This photograph on the top, that's a bunch of people in Vatican Square in Rome, and they're listening to a speech by the Pope. And that's what it looks like in 2005, and that's what it looks like in 2012, where everybody has a smartphone or an iPad. And this is a huge change that occurred. All those people knew how to read very capably in 2005, but by 2012, they're doing this other activity that may be altering their brain map significantly. So between 2004 and 2008, there's several studies that were done in that period on Americans. And most Americans in 2008, no matter what their age, spent at least 8.5 hours looking at some kind of screen device, a television, a computer monitor, their smartphone, something, 8.5 hours. It's much more than that now. But it went from very minimal in 2004 to 2008, 8.5 hours every day. Now, at that same time, the amount people read was falling precipitously. So again, from 2004 to 2008, there was an 11% drop in the amount that all Americans read written word from a page. But the really interesting thing is in that same period of time, young adults between ages 25 and 34 who were using the internet much more, their reading time dropped by 29%, and it became only 47 hours a week. So that's 49 minutes a week. That's just 7 minutes a day that people were reading. 8.5 hours on a digital device and 7 minutes reading. And that just completely altered the kind of stimulus that was being given to the brain in order to make neuronal connections. And obviously, the brain's going to respond to that and make very different neuronal connections. The shift from paper to screen doesn't just change the way we navigate a piece of writing, it also influences the degree of attention we devote to it and the depth of our immersion in it. So it's really fundamentally affected the way we absorb information. This guy, Cory Doctorow, says that whenever we turn on our computer, we're plunged into an ecosystem of interruption technologies. An ecosystem of interruption technologies. Now, that just means that information is coming into our brain in such a different way than it did when we were using print to get a lot of that information. And it's restructuring our brain in a completely different way. Now, in the next talk, we're going to be looking at, well, what are the implications of that? Is that good? Is that bad? Obviously, it's a significant difference. And it's not just a difference of, oh, I'm choosing to read this and I'm choosing to get my information off the internet for that. In fact, if you're choosing consistently to get your information off the internet for that, it's shaping one kind of brain. And that kind of brain might not be so good at reading anymore. So is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Think about that. And the next talk will extend that idea, and then we'll talk about it in the check-in. See ya.